Okay, and now one more time, very warm welcome to this Econ Bioart Lab webinar on deep futures, radioactivity, and the arts. And my great pleasure is to have two fantastic speakers today with us, namely Erich Berger from the University of Oulu in Finland and Thomas Keating from Linköping University in Sweden. I will, of course, introduce both of you in a moment, but I just want to say maybe a few more words about today's session. So as you can probably very quickly conclude from the title, this is a webinar that kind of will introduce us or will kind of launch us into the topic around the questions of modern human timescales, geology, the lithic, radioactivity, nuclear presence, nuclear futures, and of course the artistic potentials that that are there for perhaps imagining or reimagining the present and the future, maybe otherwise, maybe in different ways. And also I want to say that actually, today's session opens a series of webinars or a kind of, a sort of curated semester of webinars that will really kind of zoom in on the questions around geology and the lithic in the context of contemporary art or kind of broadly understood eco-art. And I think before I introduce both of today's speakers, I also wanted to say that today's session, to me, is very much kind of interlinked, while it has never been really pronounced as such, to kind of questions pertaining to critical heritage studies, for instance, and philosophies around how we can imagine, heritage completely, redefined and in the kind of more than human sense, and maybe even kind of questions the notion of heritage to begin with. And, without kind of going maybe too much into theorizing around this, I just want to actually leave you in this little introduction with a quote from a psychoanalyst and philosopher, Felix Guattari, who I think has been also very close to, both my own writing, but also I think I sense the presence of Guattari in different ways. Both of today's speakers think around the questions of ecology in this very kind of wide way. So let me just read this little fragment from 1983. Utopia today, and just to know this is from 1983. We are in 24, so 40 years later. Utopia today is to believe that current societies will be able to continue along their merry little way without major upheavals. Social modes of organization that prevail today on Earth are not holding up, literally and figuratively. History is gripped by crazy parameters: demography, energy, the technological scientific explosion, pollution, the arms race. The Earth is deterritorializing itself at top speed. The true utopians are conservatives of all shapes and sizes who would like for us, for this, quote, to hold up at all the same, unquote, to return to yesterday and the day before yesterday. What is terrifying is our lack of collective imagination in a world that has reached such a boiling point, unquote. And I think that, I would like to leave us with this little quotation from Guattari, because to me, and I think to many of you who came to today's seminar, artistic research and art is perhaps, and kind of like aesthetics and thinking with aesthetics is perhaps a way to also imagine that, to make that attempt of imagining differently. Okay, my dears, so having done this, a bit too extensive introduction, I just want to also introduce our speakers. So just say a few words. And We'll first listen to the presentation by Erich Berger. The title of the presentation is Of Landscape Machines and Spectral Landscapes. And Erich Berger is a doctoral researcher, artist, and curator based in Helsinki. He works at the University of Oulu in Finland, where he conducts transdisciplinary research into how artists approach temporalities beyond human-centered time, intersecting cultural anthropology with art and geology. His artistic focus lies on issues of deep time and hybrid ecology, which led him to work with geological processes, radiogenic phenomena, and their sociopolitical implications in the here and now. And also, I will, in one go, introduce Thomas, who will tell us today about speculative techniques, nuclear waste burial, and the management of deep earth futures. And Dr. Thomas Keating is a postdoctoral researcher at LIU at Department of Thematic Studies. And Thomas's work intersects cultural geography and process philosophies and engages with problems involving human-technology relationships. He has recently published on nuclear memory, technogenesis, geophilosophy, speculative empiricism, and speculative geographies. He's currently writing a document for the Swedish Nuclear Waste Management Company for their nuclear waste repository to last 100,000 years. Am I kind of reading it correctly? I think yes, right? Okay, my dears. But I think having said that, I took a lot of time. But now I will pass the baton actually to Erich first. Or maybe I just should say that we'll run in such a way that we'll have two presentations, and after the presentations, we will have also a little comfort break. And then some kind of biological element and the kind of broader discussion. But let's just run this show. So Erich, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marietta. Let me share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Excellent. So, yeah. Hello, everyone. And thank you, everyone, for joining this afternoon. And yeah, especially thank you, Marietta, for the invitation and the possibility to present and discuss together with Thomas today. And as you said, I'm a doctoral researcher currently in cultural anthropology at the University of Oulu. And so I'm an anthropologist in training, so to speak, very new for me. And yeah, my research is in this intersection of cultural anthropology with art and geology to study how artists approach temporalities beyond human-centered time, as you said already. But in short, basically, I want to gain insight into how artistic practices might become part of an obviously much larger cultural imagination that then can connect the present-day society with the futures. And this research grew from my background in the arts, where, as you also mentioned, I was working as an artist, or I'm still working actually, as an artist, curator, and facilitator. And while the thesis is looking into the work of many practitioners, in this presentation today, I will focus on my own work. And thank you, Marietta, for giving me this space today. My long-standing interest in geology and deep time has spurred me to work with processes which run on timescales that exceed the way we humans experience time in our everyday life, and as well with questions about deep future implications of human activity. This in turn has led me to work with the nuclear contemporary, and figuring prominently in my work are two concepts: deep time, which is understood as the past geological time, basically the history of the planet or of the Earth as a planetary object from its origins until the present, and then deep futures, which do not yet exist, and they rather constitute a thought vehicle for speculation within this kind of probability space of a future Earth. In 2013, I was part of an art and activist camp in Pyhäjoki in Finland, organized by Mari Keski-Kuosu, and that was basically taking place in the back then unspoiled site of the future Hanhikivi nuclear power plant, which construction was now cancelled because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, as the company building this plant was the Russian state-owned Rosatom. And we were a good amount of artists, activists, scientists who worked for more than 2 weeks on nuclear topics through various workshops, seminars, walks, and also visits to the local karaoke bar. But for me, the outcome of this field lab was the insight that in the Anthropocene, we experience a sort of convergence of natural history and social history. Because our energy-rich life today very much depends on the life of the past, the fossil fuels, as we all know, but even that we are able to mine uranium is a doing of life, and the result of this great oxidation event like 2.7 billion years ago. And now, present-day human activity is setting the conditions and possibilities for future life in general, and also humans in particular. So this excavation of relations between deep time, the now, and deep futures is, I think, also in general visible in the arts and the humanities as a geologic term. And it leads to geologic practices and thinking which go beyond the earth sciences and to probe and apply questions of deep time and deep futures concerning intentional and inadvertent anthropogenic activity with then future implications. So there are, I think, many artists and practitioners working on this topic at the moment. In terms of the nuclear contemporary, I think this convergence of social history and natural history materializes itself in Finland most strikingly with Onkalo, the deep geological nuclear waste repository. And I will not go into details, as this will be the topic of Thomas' talk, I believe. But these timescales which have been laid out by the Onkalo project really haunted me, because it is said to be engineered to hold the waste back for the at least next 100,000 years. But I was haunted not because 100,000 years is such a long time. I mean, it is, but because 100,000 years is actually marginal compared to the half-lives of the nuclear waste, which is buried. And it seemed to me that if we move waste just far enough in time, it will not concern us anymore. But that, of course, is only true if we do not care about what comes after us. The artwork Inheritance, which I did together with jewelry artist Mari Ketu, is an attempt to kind of address the temporal scales and ethics of Onkalo. And Inheritance consists of precious jewelry, a necklace, a set of earring, and a brooch, which we made with natural radioactive stones containing uranium and thorium, and therefore this jewelry is unwearable for deep futures. And the accompanying autoradiography, which you also can see on the slide, shows evidence of the radioactivity. And Inheritance is stored in a concrete container together with a set of supporting instruments, which are then designed to endure over a vast amount of time. in the exhibition itself, the jewelry is presented together with the autoradiography we saw already, and a portrait of the beneficiaries. And in a sound recording, these beneficiaries voice their life and their experience with this burdensome heritage. And they tell the story of the ritual of measurement, which is to be performed each time when the jewelry is handed over from one generation to the next. And this ritual determines if the jewelry can finally be brought in use and fulfill its promise of wealth and identity, or if it has to be stored away again until the next generation will make a new attempt. The ritual is carried out according to instructions, which are inscribed in the copper lid of the container, which we can see here also in the left lower corner. And all instruments for the ritual, which essentially is a process to measure the remaining radioactivity of the jewelry, are in the box and are basically in working condition. A variation of the jewelry work is Open Care, which are also produced in collaboration with Mariketo. And Open Care is a set of artifacts which propose a very different social thought experiments. What if nuclear waste were a very personal responsibility and thus part of our everyday life? What if instead of burying the waste in deep underground repositories, we would care for it over generations in our own homes and as part of our daily routine? And by that, basically hand the responsibility of the waste over to those who benefited from the energy production. So what I'm keen to do in my work is to stage experiments for an object, a thing, a machine, a process, or a question to articulate itself through an intrinsic feature of itself, through its own language, if you wish, so that the artwork reveals their evidence through their own materiality, through their temporal properties and the processes they enact. And in the case of inheritance and Open Care, it is the nuclear decay of the materials that are integrated in the works, but also the stories which are attached to the work. A couple of years ago, on a field trip to the Palkiskuru uranium prospect in northern Finland, me and my friend, we were kind of roaming and running around for 3 days with our detectors, and you can see the detectors on the left on the slide, to kind of find these the radiation or the uranium in this landscape. And we could see here and there small spots with elevated radiation until the third day, when we found a vein which was probably like 100 meters long and up to 50-meter wide. And it was emanating a varying but really intense radiation, also measurable from a distance and from above. So the experience was so that basically what was previously had only been some points on the ground where we were basically, where there was the need to kind of point at, all of a sudden presented itself as something massive with a shape and objecthood which is sitting there in the middle of the landscape, but invisible. So I imagined a bizarre, but yeah, probably very beautiful topography which is rising from the landscape. Unreal shapes, large soft bodies of gamma radiation which are protruding from the smoothly shaped hill rocks and fade into the sky. And I wanted to know more about how such a spectral landscape would look like. So I then identified other places in Finland which also have natural radiation in the ground, and I started to work in southern Finland in a place called Kovila, which I found particularly interesting as it is basically a place rich in rare earth elements, and they are part of this so-called critical metals. And the term critical here in terms of economy and technology. Because of that, it's basically registered as a possible future potential mining site because of that. The radioactivity there is originating from the radioactive decay of natural uranium and thorium that is locked in the mineral monazite, which we see here also on the slide, which is itself the main bearer of this rare earth element and basically the desired mineral to be mined. And these tiny crystals, they basically make up a good amount of the rock, and so the whole area is basically quite radioactive. So I built an apparatus which allows me basically to record the radiation data, the intensity of this gamma radiation which is emitted by the rock. And it is built quite small and flexible, so I can use it in the hand to collect the ground radiation, but also, as I said, quite light, so I can fly it as a payload on a drone to basically then be able to collect the data above the ground. And I also use this drone to create high-resolution ground images, which I then also need for the final work. So the mapping of the area itself is a bit tedious. The detector saves basically each second a pair of data with the radiation intensity and the location. And so I spend hours to systematically walk the area, and it takes sometimes several days to complete depending on the location. And so far I have carried this out in about 9 places in Finland. The data which I gain by hand give me a good idea of the extent of the radiation field. And as my setup is entirely mobile, I can already see on site if anything is missing or needs more work. So you see, I also want to give you a little bit insight basically on what is happening before the work is actually shown. So the next step is then to map the 3D volume of the field with the drone. And I basically look how far up the radiation goes. And at Kovila, this intensity is comparable with the radiation you receive during an intercity flight at travel altitude. So maybe some of you know that that basically the cosmic radiation produces also radiation in the atmosphere. And if you fly with a plane, then actually at flight height, the radiation is about 200 to 300 times larger than on the ground. And in Kovila, it is comparable to this amount. So in the last step, basically, I proceed to photographically map the area to get these high resolution images. This so-called orthophoto is stitched together of 1,500 single images, and it's an area of 400 by 250 meters. So, and then I basically finally put data and images together to create these high resolution prints, which can have the size from up to 3 by 1.5 meters, very detailed then basically when you go close. And what we can see here is basically these gamma field bodies from Kovila, which extend up to 100 meters from the ground up into the sky. And I don't know if you see it here very well, but if you look basically between these two towers, then you will also see a path with this kind of yellow bars, but they are very tiny, very small, and that basically means that between these two towers there is no heightened radioactivity. So this is really basically what you can see here are these bodies which are basically coming out really above those those uranium-bearing rocks. Here's the same image in an exhibition. And yeah, I refer to these bodies as spectral because their presence is ghostly and can only be detected via extrasensorial means. I cannot see them. But then they are also spectral because they are actually fields of light. They are photons also located in a part of the spectrum not visible to the human eye. So they operate on a different scale. And I think scale is also something which is, especially when we talk here about time, when we talk about more than human relations, really something very important to look at. Anyway, so deep time, deep futures, innate and human-made landscapes, the nuclear contemporary, all these basically serves as an input and a kind of backdrop to spectral landscapes. Here's another example, and this is now the Palkiskuru uranium deposit, the place which initially triggered my curiosity. The first image which I showed you was from there. It was this vein which we originally found in 2015, and this area is about 100 by 50 meters. No, sorry, it's a wrong caption. It is actually the area of about 200 by 100 meters of this landscape. What I also started there was to lay out large format X-ray films. And you can see one of those films here in the image placed on the rock, which it's packaged in a light safe. And this film is sensitive to gamma radiation. And it's packaged into the light safe because it's also sensitive to normal light, but the gamma radiation is able to penetrate through the light safe. And I do this to produce autoradiographies, like self-portraits of the landscape, self-portraits which are produced basically through its own light, if you wish. And in Palkiskuru, the uranium mineralization mainly consists of davidite, which you can see here on the image as well. It is a rare earth oxide mineral which can contain a substantial amount of uranium. And these crystals, they are basically also here finely distributed in this rock and make it therefore radioactive. Here we can see the result of such an exposure. And while the landscape data image, which we saw before, shows the macro level of the radiation in the landscape, the autoradiography allows a view basically into the micro level. And like light with the photographic film, the gamma radiation emitted by those crystals, which I showed to you, expose the film and reveal then their distribution in the landscape. And you can imagine each crystal to be the core of a tiny cone of invisible light that is directed from the rock towards the sky and makes then those spectral landscape parts. Here a few exhibition views from this Palkiskuru prospect. And I also want to say that I collect my own data because by doing so, the relation between the world and my questions and the thinking becomes intertwined through my own experience. And I think that this gives the data context and brings them alive. The data alone, of course, would be abstract, but by being in the field, I walk the forest, I see what is there, the life, the features of geology and mineralogy, the relations to the surroundings, and I can make connections and relations which easily remain outside of, for example, single discipline scientific research. my wish is to offer experiences with my work which turn the attention towards the complexities of our being and also towards the depth of reality and the fact that human scales operate just among many others. And specifically with this work, with the nuclear contemporary, I ask myself, what do we leave behind? What will the future inherit from us? How can we as individuals in society deal with the scales and with the scopes of deep time as we get increasingly entangled in planetary time scales through our activities? These questions figure also prominently in the last project I will introduce, which is called Landscape Machines. And in 2021, I was invited to work with the nuclear heritage site of the only ever existing uranium mine in Slovenia, which is called Sirovski Vrh. And it is located about 40 kilometers west of Ljubljana. And the purpose of the mine was to produce nuclear fuel for the Krško nuclear power plant. And the ore mining started in 1982. But then later mining and production were suspended in the 1990s. And then the intensive remediation and shutdown of the uranium mine began 8 years later, 1998. And today what remains are two landfills. They are approximately 1 kilometer apart, and they are called Jaspek and Borst, and they are maintained with the idea of long-term stewardship. Originally uranium was prospected actually because Tito was dreaming about the Yugoslavian nuclear bomb. And in the 60s of the last century, he was basically sending out geologists into the country to find him uranium for this purpose. And we actually rediscovered those original boulders, which led those geologists to the discovery of the uranium in this valley. And also here on the image, you see one of those boulders, and then also the UV lamp, ultraviolet light lamp in the smaller image gives evidence of the uranium mineralization in one of those remaining test edits, which have been driven shortly after this discovery. This cleanup operation, the remediation, and the original conditioning of the remaining mining and processing waste, I think is really exemplary. But the future that exists for this place is really basically based on a worldview of a stable surrounding and the politics, which is based on a 4-year election cycle, which is kind of really an odd mixture when you think it is basically toxic waste in a deep time, tectonically really active region. And yeah, on the images, you see kind of documentation of field work, collecting video, sound, and environmental data for the artwork. For the work, my attempt was to build a cluster of different elements to connect the gallery space with the real site, to use observations from the landfill in the form of video and soundscapes, which then interact with sensor-based observatories in the gallery, which I have set up there. And as a central element, there is also a cloud chamber holding a proxy landscape of the landfills, which performs its machinic nature by showing us the outgassing and the radioactivity of such a place. Basically, I concentrated on everything which is invisible, basically the presence of that which is beyond the human sensorial capabilities. And I conclude with a short text I wrote for the exhibition. While the world around the landfills is busy and keeps moving, the movement of the landfills is undesirable. as it would lead to the spilling of its contaminated heritage. The landfills themselves are kept in a state of assisted stasis and are under continuous observation. Every deviation from the zero state raises concern. We see in front of us a landscape machine. Though the mining has ceased and the remediation effort has covered the toxic remains for the time being, the machinic continues to operate in this landscape. It is a machine that does not carry out work for a benefit in an economic sense. It does not produce. It only indebts the present and the deep future. We would prefer to have it slip from memory and forget it into non-existence. However, the Earth's processes and forces which labor on the landfill demand that the machine keeps going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erich. That was fantastic. I'm just going to say to everyone in the room that we are doing it in a way that we will actually run presentation after presentation, more or less 20 minutes per each. And after that, we'll have a break and then we'll reconvene. So, just to kind of like do this housekeeping information. So I'm actually right now just passing the baton to you, Thomas, and I'm going to remove spotlight from Erich for a second. So now you are in the center of the screen and we are trying to connect the slides.
Perfect. I'm hoping that works. Okay.
Right. So now we see the editor's view. Super.
Brilliant. And just to say thanks so much, Marietta, for the chance to speak in this webinar, and for your enthusiasm for these such interesting, exciting ideas. And I've been a big fan of Erich's work for some time. So yeah, my name's Thomas Keating. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Linköping University in Sweden. And I'm currently completing a 2-year project with Professor Anna Storm, which is really thinking, it's actually a project commissioned by SKB, the Swedish nuclear waste or nuclear fuel and waste management company, which I'll go into in the talk. And it's a project with a finite amount of time, but it's full of kind of ideas that stretch much beyond the frame of the project. And my background is in human geography, and I've got particular interest in thinkers like Deleuze and Guattari and Simondon. And this work really does, as Marietta mentioned, connect up to questions of critical heritage, particularly Anna's work in atomic heritage is very explicit about that. But to begin this talk on kind of questions of speculative techniques, I want to begin in the middle. The sounds you just heard came from Marguerite Demo's Opera of Prehistoric Creatures. Opera of Prehistoric Creatures consists of a series of artworks dating back around 10 years ago, in which Hemo explored the possibility of listening to the sounds of organisms that once walked the earth before the existence of the human. In the example you just heard, the sounds belong to the entelodont, sometimes referred to as the hell pig, that inhabited the earth around 38 to 19 million years ago, and whose call has never been heard by human ears. To create this piece, Hemo worked with numerous researchers, including paleontologists and elephant vocalization specialists. The aim was to produce the vocal tracks of various prehistoric creatures, including the entelodont, in order to explore reenacting their sound. Yet in developing this artwork, Hemo and the other experts encountered a very specific material problem. Soft tissue, like the vocal tract, does not easily fossilize. Therefore, unlike fossilized bones, these remains are rarely detectable in the earth over millions of years. Amo's solution was to use fossil data from the entelodont that does exist to perform MRI scans that approximate the size and features of the creature. She extrapolated the shape and form of the vocal tract from currently living creatures of a similar size and morphology, in this case based on an elephant. The result was a digitally modelled reconstruction of the entelodont's vocal tract. This model was then 3D printed with air blown through it to create sound. In thinking with Amo's prehistoric prototypes, what I'm interested in is the capacity of art and aesthetics to produce experiences of sense that have hitherto never been experienced before. And in this example, what Amo refers to as her, quote, semi-real synthetic ruins, end quote, the sounds created from the entelodont vocal tract sculpture is very likely not an exact reproduction of the actual sound expressed by the hell pig millions of years ago. Indeed, one of the major implications of this work is not gauged in its empirical validity, but in its specific capacity to expose the subject to a sound that may have remained otherwise unimaginable or entirely incomprehensible. So I begin with this kind of key question for the talk, which is how to understand the specific capacity of art to express the inexpressible. And relatedly, how could or should this capacity connect up to wider questions of nuclear waste management? And I'm particularly thinking about in the future context. So there's kind of two focuses to this talk, which is the first, this kind of problem of buried nuclear waste that should last 100,000 years in the future. And the second is how this connects up to speculative techniques and the management of nuclear waste futures. So in April 2021, myself and Anna Storm began a project commissioned by SKB, the Swedish Nuclear Fuel and Waste Management Company. The aim was to write a document for a permanent repository for spent nuclear fuel. This permanent repository, what a permanent repository refers to, is the plan to bury the most radioactive remains of energy production inside copper canisters underground for the entire duration that these materials pose a threat to organic life. So the technology of this burial site must last at least 100,000 years, which is the time deemed that the radioactivity of this waste will return to levels approximating its pre-fission reaction levels, although this time frame is sometimes disputed. And the whole premise of the permanent repository, which is underway actually in Sweden and Finland, is that it is a kind of lock it up and throw away the key approach, which is to say that this waste is not designed to be retrievable, and there's no plans for human monitoring over 100,000 years. Indeed, it should be kind of almost, it should be a kind of passive monitoring system, which means that it doesn't require active engagement from actors over its entire time span. And obviously, this is quite an important feature of this design model, precisely because if the waste had to be monitored by humans for 100,000 years and more, potentially, it would become so expensive and obviously dwarf the prices associated with other forms of energy production. So the burial site that's chosen in Sweden is Forsmark, which is a small village around 150 kilometers north of Stockholm. And the role that myself and Anna are playing, continue to work on in this project is to write this, which is the key information file. The key information file is a document conceived partly through OECD kind of Nuclear Energy Association working groups, particularly RKNM and IDKNM. So these kind of expert working groups who've designed a document or conceptualized a document that will be printed and will be a kind of centerpiece of a wider archive that informs the future about the existence of permanent repositories for nuclear waste, and indeed other nuclear waste repositories around the world. So the conceptualization here is that this document is written, in our case, in the Swedish context, but that every nuclear waste producing nation would eventually have a key information file that they've written, and that somehow these different key information files would connect it up to each other and provide a kind of international system of information transfer and information communication across generations into the future. And there's a series of principles that define the key information file, or KIF. That's the essential information, which is the kind of information, the deemed essential, is about the underdevelopment repository in Forsmark, and it should be understandable to the widest audience possible. So in this sense, the KIF is different to a standard written report. It should be something that remains open to different kinds of future and different kinds of future readers. So in this sense, there's often a kind of implicit demand in the key information file that it should be written with an openness to all kinds of readers over different timeframes and from different cultural contexts. And that's also the sense that there are multiple possible futures. So we need to think about the sense of the future in its multiplicity. And even the sense the reader could be non-human, and this even kind of quite seriously positing the idea of a kind of AI being a most likely reader of a key information file in 100 or 200 years. And this sense of contingency for us has kind of become a really important part of this, that there isn't kind of settled idea of the future, and actually the way the key information files are written should be sensitive to different contingencies, different possible futures that could happen. In the process of writing the key information file, we've encountered various problems and difficulties in writing this. I mean, the kind of common refrain when I tell people about this project is this kind of like raised eyebrows, kind of, nodding, good luck kind of acknowledgement, which is to say that this is a document that's quite ambitious, to say the least, and particularly thinking it's meant to support a plan to last across millennia. It's also clearly, the task of writing a document for this time frame is reminiscent of the kind of hubristic thinking associated with Anthropocene thinking and debates. The idea that the human today can imagine and plan along geological timescales. So there's also implied in this is the role of signs, semiotics, and language. I mean, over 100,000 years, no contemporary language systems will be effectual for communicating across those timeframes. And one of the things that struck us in speaking to experts and kind of visiting different sites for the planned nuclear waste repository in Forsmark was the way that experts described and discussed the nuclear waste. It was quite striking to us that there was a sense of a kind of ability to straddle both past and future timescales, a sense that experts who associated with this project had a kind of more lucid idea of what the future will hold, and also a more lucid idea of the kind of geological timeframes that we are beholden to because of these people spending so much time underground, immersed in the rock. So probably the most significant problem in writing the key information file is this, that no human message has ever lasted really half the time of 100,000 years. But there are examples of human messages resembling kind of information transfer and archival transfer that have been communicated over a few thousand years. And these examples are kind of often discussed in expert discussions around nuclear waste management, everything from tsunami stones in Japan, human remains in Egyptian sarcophagus, mythologies and stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh, and cave painting, this one in Spain, the image here, which was recently dated, its age is actually nearly doubled, according to scientific measurements, to 64,800 years old. Yet in all these cases, the message that's communicated is often no longer understandable or has been deliberately or accidentally ignored or misinterpreted. And that includes kind of thinking especially of the kind of classic example is Egyptian remains, where hieroglyphics were either intentionally or willingly ignored in order to enter a certain tomb. So how to communicate the existence of permanent nuclear waste burial sites across millennia, and it's clearly no small question. And we were really inspired by Rosemary Joyce's writing on the subject in The Future of Nuclear Waste, where she writes, again, suggesting how we can convey a perfect message from our present past to a future present. But instead, what is needed is a different sensibility that allows for, quote, a way to imagine a future of contending common senses. And it's at this point the kind of question of speculation and speculative techniques comes back into the fold. Speculative research methods kind of quite, in a kind of most kind of immediate way reformulate relations of human and non-human. And particularly we're interested in this kind of recent paper that Anna and I wrote on nuclear memory, with kind of the role of practices and rituals, as Eric mentioned as well, and performative research that already engages with longue durée forms of temporal communication. So this clearly includes indigenous practices and artworks and knowledges. And I was really kind of moved by Patrick Nunn's book on this subject on stories in the Australian context. So speculative techniques, in a way, to kind of home in on this kind of theoretical idea, and is really concerning the way that speculating can problematize, rethink what counts as evidence and empirical material. And I was particularly thinking of Isabel Stenger's quote in writing this, where she writes about the role of speculation that can disturb the margins of evidence required, which is to say that speculation is really about not necessarily abstract thinking, and it's not necessarily just about imagining different scenarios. And it's obviously not associated with kind of economic speculation either, but it's really precisely understood as this attempt to expand what counts as the evidential and remake it based on all those things that are discounted from contemporary ideas of the evidential and indeed the experiential. So in this recent edited collection on speculative geographies, we're really intrigued by this sense of speculation following Isabel Stenger's and Didier Debay's, in the sense that it opens thought to what it might become and reconfigures the empirical beyond what seems immediately given in experience. So this is the kind of there's two key implications of this idea of speculative thinking. The first is admitting the alternative in thought, which is to say that there are other expressions, other ways of evaluating events, other ways of evaluating experience, and that speculative thinking would be a task of creating new abstractions that allow for different ways of evaluating, different ways of experiencing the here and now. The second implication is that speculation concerns exposing the subject to the infrasensible and extrasensorial expression that bypass the human sensorium. And this is really where I was kind of really fascinated with Eric's paper too, in that he's, so much emphasis on this question of the infrasensible, the invisible, the imperceptible. And specifically, speculative thinking is really about trying to disturb the limits of what experience is counted as. So trying to remake those limits and allow for different kinds of expression. So this is just to conclude now, and linking back to kind of questions of deep futures and radioactivities. I'm really fascinated by the capacity of art, and this is the key to Hermot's work, to register alternative durations of the past and the future. So this is really about how it can expose thought, expose the subject to those unthinkable and inexpressible forms of sense. And this is really linking as well to what Deleuze terms singularity events, and he writes that in terms of the Stoics, and kind of this kind of sense of the tree greens, but also in his writing on Francis Bacon and the kind of singularity of the mouth and this repetition of Francis Bacon's paintings in trying to, why return to the mouth? Why have this obsession with recreating the sense of, the sense that every single mouth is singular. There's no exact sameness in any painting. So what does the singular do? Well, it exposes thought to difference on the alternative. And this concerns really the way art and aesthetics can direct thought to different registers of experience and different temporalities of the earth. And this is really what nuclear memory tries to do too in our configuration of it, art, and this is kind of the center of this argument, is a kind of involves speculative techniques. They involve things that are not necessarily, like, they're not verifiable, they're not scientifically valid in that sense, but clearly concern a realm of alternate suggestions that are real and expand what counts as the experiential. So I'm really intrigued by how practices, and artistic practices especially, lend themselves to imagining nuclear waste futures differently. And that's it. I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Thomas. So let me just here redo the screen for a moment. Okay, my dears, I think that, for now, big applause to both of you. What I wanted to say is that we are organized in such a way that we will actually send you everyone for a kind of 10-minute, little sort of, comfort break. And I will feeling that Cecilia, who is in the audience, will laugh because we love comfort breaks. But after the break, actually we reconvene and we'll have this kind of like, pre-organized dialogical element, and after that dialogical element, which I hope will inspire you to actually engage in the conversation, will open the floor to everyone. So if you have questions, please collect them, and feel free to type them down in the chat box, or just kind of like keep them until the moment we'll open the floor. But for now, we reconvene at 2:20 Central European time. So literally in 9 minutes, and we kind of like fight along. So thank you so much once again, and enjoy your little stretch break.
Of that project, and I was interested by the way that those durations of radioactivity become kind of irrefutable. You can't argue. They become a kind of base to layer up a lot of other kinds of thinking and practice. I wondered about that. How irrefutable are they, or how do we measure? How do we gauge those durations, both in terms of the way we think about time, but also the way we think about speeds of decay, and the promise of kind of technological change that might change that decay. And I might actually kind of pose a question here. It'd be kind of interesting to hear your thoughts on this kind of first question, which is, when inheritance, I was thinking a lot about other kind of toxic radioactive human remains, particularly those that are indefinitely toxic, like forever chemicals, PFAs, or even mercury, I think, and arsenic too. Do these materials deserve more artistic attention and engagement? And what kind of inheritance do these kinds of forever chemicals and indefinitely toxic chemicals demand?
Yeah, I think I haven't given that too much thought yet about forever chemicals, but that is definitely another example how current human activity is basically setting down the conditions for life in the future. And actually, like when we talk about the future, we actually also talk about the present, no? Because these are really kind of like also when we talk about the future of nuclear waste, then we actually also talk about the present and what we are doing here, and that forever chemicals and their presence in our environment is not necessarily only a problem for the future, but it is a continuous problem which is already present here. And the same is also with nuclear waste. So And why do we need to think about the presence is that it's not only to think about what we do with this heritage, but actually how to avoid it in the first place. And I think that often maybe gets, I mean, it's not something I'm dealing in my work with, but it's something we need, when we discuss that, I think that is actually the primary question, which often gets kind of swallowed by the question, what happens with the heritage? But what would be a future and a presence without even needing to think about that heritage? And I think that there is a lot of work needs to go in. I mean, especially now when we see a kind of a renaissance of nuclear power, especially these small nuclear reactors, which we hear already now in the news about, and which we will hear much more in the next coming years. These small units where the nuclear industry is imagining that basically each neighborhood will have its own kind of small, almost kind of portable nuclear reactor. And so while we think about what we are doing with the waste we have already accumulated, which is really important and and that's why like efforts like in Finland, Onkalo, and also Forsmark in Sweden need to be really congratulated, because they are the first ones doing this. This should not be at the same time an encouragement to continue with the production of nuclear waste. And that basically counts, I would say, with all toxicities which are produced.
I have a connected question to that, but first I just wanted to really express, in case the time runs out, and I'll get to do it, that Kavella was really inspiring, and I thought actually the kind of spectral, ghostly kind of relations that you make palpable in that work is, yeah, really intriguing and interesting. I mean, the sense that these fields are kind of real, but they're imperceptible. And in that sense, I can see that kind of relation of speculation too, in that they kind of disturb what we think as a landscape, and actually what counts as landscape. I think that's what's really evocative. And it connects a little bit, I mean, to open care and how radiation is a kind of constant here, as a kind of not ground, but a kind of origin point for some of these modes of thinking, that you start with the radiation and kind of build up almost. And I was wondering about, I mean, because in a way, what Kavella shows is the kind of presence and the kind of naturalness of radiation in landscape. And I wondered about whether you also considered relations to the human body, so things like potassium-40, which is a kind of mildly radioactive element in the body, and how you might incorporate that into your practice, whether that's something you'd ever considered, precisely because these, I mean, like Kavella already does, there's a need to kind of destabilize the kind of stubborn nature-culture distinctions that still characterize the way radioactivity is often discussed. Radioactivity is seen as human, as a kind of human construct, or particularly nuclear waste is often associated with a kind of human, mistake or problem. But of course, a lot of these plans to bury waste force us to think about that differently, and perhaps even admit the kind of naturalness of these elements into the earth. So I wondered whether you'd consider the skill of the body within these kinds of modes of thinking.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a really funny question, because I mean, like, being together basically means being exposed to the radioactivity of someone else. No, just the amounts, of course, are really tiny, and we cannot. I think we are talking here about statistics more than anything else, and of course also like when we talk about radioactive decay, that is also statistic. But of course, I mean, it is really also then a question of thresholds, because we have like a lot of radioactivity in our everyday life. In medicine, it is basically a life giver, yeah, because we use it in imaging technologies, and we are exposed there to levels of radiation which are also quite enormous. Yeah, there is a whole group of people who kind of run around with detectors every day, and then they're always very excited when I don't know, they meet somebody. They will never see the person who it was, but it registered on their detector because they had just some sort of screening, and the isotope is still in the body, and they are basically glowing, yeah, really brightly, if you would be able to see that. Yeah. And I mean, there's also a lot of there's a whole community of people who think that actually radioactivity might be like not harmful to a certain extent, but I'm not going into that. I'm also not kind of not I think interested in those kind of mythologies, but the fact that radioactivity and decay is something which is part of our physical universe, there is no doubt, and there are a number of natural isotopes which are present in the body, and it's actually also something which makes our bodies vulnerable to nuclear accidents. That's why, for example, we are asked to take iodine pills when there is like the explosion of a nuclear power plant, or the possibility of this, to basically fill up our glands, which would otherwise collect the natural iodide, that there is not the possibility that we take up an isotope. Or also a similar, I think, problem would be like cesium, where the body would take it up as it would be calcium, because it can be also kind of put into the bone structure. So there is this kind of, there are these interconnections, and
Great, and now we should swap the cards. I'm sorry, I'm starting to be like time sensitive here. Hey, do you have a question to Thomas?
I have, and Thomas, thank you so much for kind of also taking the possibility to kind of kind of highlight some of the things I was presenting. I also made some notes here, and I was also like, your task is really exciting, and I think it just triggers the imagination and lets the mind wander. And I'm sure whenever you are kind of showing up somewhere, everyone comes with a different new kind of possibility what you should do. So I will try to avoid that today. And we'll actually now just start with a really simple question. Because you were concentrating basically on the how do you transmit the message to the future, and what are the culprits, what are the difficulties. You showed us also like similar kind of problems and how they were solved, but also like what type of messages have been surviving. So you were concentrating basically on the medium. Yeah. My question is, what is the message? what do you imagine? And maybe you can also kind of go into that a little bit, because I think that it will also depend on the medium, what kind of message you can give, and I'm sure you have thought about that. And could you go into that maybe a little bit?
Yes, I mean, I'll try and keep it brief for the sake of allowing other comments, but yeah, it's really brilliant point about the medium and the message. I'd probably add another bifurcation, which is style and substance, and I think that's one of the ideas that's driven what Anna and I wrote in the KIF, the key information file, is that the sense that style is substantial, that the way that the information is presented is part of its capacity to be remembered and understood and acknowledged. And that's why increasingly we're interested in artistic methods and approaches to communicating, seeing that style as a kind of, not a like a kind of superfluous thing, but as a kind of real way that information becomes lived. And I think really inspired by thinking about mythologies and how they relate to kind of earth events. So think like the Minotaur supposedly links to an earthquake in Crete, and the way that stories, those myths are kind of transmitted orally. So they're an oral tradition, they're not written down. And the reason they're remembered is because they're retold, they're reinvented and added with new exciting details and perhaps aberrations added. And it's something about that ethos of kind of recreation, difference, and a kind of exposure to completely changing things that I think is central to the key information file, strangely, even though that seems to go against a lot of the kind of safety measures associated with it. So that's really more on the medium and how it connects to the message. But part of, I guess, the one message, if there's one simple message in the thing that we've wrote, is this sense of kind of a kind of pictogram of what a reader should do with the document, which is share, imagine, renew, or shire, which is what we were kind of inspired by were things like airplane safety manuals and the way that they communicate to a quite a wide audience relatively, but doing so through images. And we thought that perhaps something around that, this invocation to share the document, to imagine how it could be recreated, and also to renew it, to create some kind of renewal, should be the central message of the key information file. So that would be it. But I can probably clarify that better by sharing the document.
I mean, you have also, in the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about it, also mentioned that you were aware that what comes after us might not be or might not only be human. And so I guess that also kind of brings in questions like, where do you kind of draw the line for, because to transmit this information basically means that there is something important which needs to be conveyed. And I'm just wondering, where does this, like, where do you draw the line, or where is, for whom will it be important, and why will it be important? Like, what is the image of that, what could be, let's say, harmed by that? And a reversal question, which kind of inverts that harmfulness, would be, I imagine that these deposits in Finland and in Sweden, I mean, they are also treasure boxes. Yeah? I mean, there are really very refined raw materials there, where I could imagine a future being getting knowledge of that, being technological, maybe would have really great desire to get into this treasure box of isotopes and copper and steel. What are your thoughts about these two sides of the coin?
Yeah, I mean, the sense of it being a treasure box is very real, that copper is a very valuable material, and will continue to be. It's very likely for lots of different uses. But yeah, I think there's also kinds of assumptions and presumption, ways of thinking what the future will need and why they might enter the site because of materials. I think carries with it a lot of assumptions about what kind of future, this kind of sense of resource scarce futures are very dominant at the moment. The sense that the future is kind of one that might be subject to lots of conflict. The sense that a future that's quite bleak is often quite characterized. One of the ideas that's quite revealed in this project really fascinated me is if you suggest that the future might be less technologically advanced than today, that a future reader might have less technological things at their disposal. That idea is kind of almost like heresy. It seems like we can't admit this idea that the future will be kind of have a less technological progress. And I thought that was a really intriguing thing to appear from different interviews we did. And I just want to kind of circle back into, the challenge of all this is really, and it's a question for your work too, of deep time and thinking about, why is it that deep time offers such an appealing opportunity for thought today? Why is it people are drawn to deep time now as a kind of set of concepts and ideas? And I think it's interesting. Relates to this lovely quote, Marietta, you had at the start from Guattari around the kind of need for the collective imaginations and to kind of inspire new kinds of collective ways of imagining. And I think that's really important. I think perhaps there's a sense that deep time offers us a different way of imagining the future, besides the human, besides the kind of contemporary present. But I'm not. The whole thing is like, but what are the limits of this kind of deep time thinking too, and what limits in terms of does it inherit some of the trappings of the Anthropocene in terms of trappings? This kind of aphoretic thinking of we have to think beyond the human, but we are human. These kind of limits can often present blockages for imagining other, perhaps more ambitious, more inspiring futures as well, which I'd like to hold on to. So that's a kind of roundabout way of answering your question.
Hey, but I understand what you're saying about the kind of the bleakness of the future. But if we, for example, look at the kind of learning from deep time and looking into what will very likely happen during the next 100,000 years of these repositories, which they are actually also constructed for, is that there might be basically 1 or 2 ice ages covering the area for 15, 20, 25,000 years. So all kind of surface structure will be like completely eradicated. When the ice retreats, we will have basically a very unrecognizable landscape, and the repositories they are engineered for that. That's what is said. So how does even if there would be not too much disturbance on the surface and the let's say a continuous society somewhere else on the planet, it still shows basically that when we involve ourselves with these scales, it's also kind of difficult to think of a continuation and of a continuous kind of society which would be able to maintain whatever culture, whatever languages. This is actually anyway what you are working on in the file. So I was actually quite, but I didn't know that the idea was that there would be many key files and they would be kind of interlinked. So that is of course a way to kind of maintain information on those places of the planet which are inhabitable. And but of course nobody knows what the future brings. So
My dears, and having said that, I think that we should open the floor to questions. And I mean, I see that, there were 3 on chat. Now I think there might be the 4th one. I'm going to do the gallery view here for all of us. Right. What I wanted to say is that, because we have one person who has unfunctional microphone, because I usually kind of just invite people to ask questions themselves. Maybe if that's okay, if I start with the second question, and then we will let first Nina, who was the first person asking the question, and then also Daisy to actually ask their questions. So I will start with Liam's question. Sorry.
I'll say one thing, that Eric mentioned before, not
Sure.
wanting to give other suggestions about how to warn the future or communicate through the key information file. I should say that I remain open to all suggestions, and actually kind of, if people have ideas in the chat, that would be kind of intriguing to read. I'm always quite interested to hear what people have to say about that.
I think, Thomas, you should not do one, you should do all of them.
But yeah, look, I think that, there might be some points of connection, or maybe I'm just kind of misreading. But so let's start with the second question, as I said, and then, I will invite Nina here. So that was Liam with microphone issues. I am wondering about the speculative potential of other temporalities. When James Hutton makes the geological developments that open up, sorry, my, my chat is kind of moving around, and that's why I'm kind of, okay. James Hutton makes the geological developments that open up the abyss of deep time. He speaks about it as having, quote, no vestige of beginning, no prospect of end, unquote. A thinking that is very different to the linear progression involved in a statement like 60,000 years ago or 100,000 years in the future. Is there any usefulness in thinking about alternate temporalities, such as mythological, cyclical time, or Claude Lévi-Strauss's conception of code societies that exist without history? Of course, this is not much used to the nuclear industry, as the speculative potential of such a thought might negate the situation in which it starts from. And I think that this is a question actually to both of you in a sense, that perhaps you would like to, bite from whatever side.
Yeah, I could start maybe because I think that it's really great question, and I'm really happy that James Hutton here is also mentioned, because he was really the first one who actually made this really amazing conceptual leap to actually think that something like geology would even exist, because the prevalent or kind of belief at his time was that being in Europe, that the Earth was like 4,000 or 5,000 years old, calculated from biblical kind of numerologies. And he saw basically through observation in his environment that this cannot be the case. However, that he basically wrote this statement of the no beginning, not the end, as at the end of his theory of the Earth, and that was the conclusion with the kind of information or with the perception he had back then. And since then, I think a lot of knowledge has been developed, which basically show that there at some point will be an end of geology when the sun will expand and will swallow the Earth in its expansion. Nevertheless, like what I think want to get here, there is maybe a difference in how to think in time philosophically and in the time we are dealing with when we talk about kind of the physical constraints of building such a depository. What do you think, Thomas?
I mean, to reiterate, yeah, really brilliant question. I think adding like a lot more specificity to what kinds of the fact that we have multiple deep time concepts kind of out there in circulation that have different implications. And you know, some of the comments I can see around this kind of trying to admit different notions of time, linear ideas of time, non-linear, but also, you know, thinking about kind of Aboriginal perspectives and this kind of topographic theories and representations of time and events. And I think they're so challenging. I think they're brilliant. I think they're so hard to admit into the kind of something like a key information file as it is currently configured. But that's also a kind of important, interesting opportunity for remaking these kind of practices. Because at the moment, to speak of kind of non-linear time just doesn't quite compute, it seems. And I think that's, yeah, there's a reason for that. It's worth more attention. I mean, art as well gives us a kind of, and I mean, I'm interested in this with the paper a little bit, with art has a kind of specific role in giving us a lens into different notions of time. And I think, why is that? What is it about art that can do that, that's different to other mediums and other genres of expression? Cinema too, as well, I think does it. And I'm intrigued by thinking about, especially, you know, relations. I mean, think about these kind of debates about who's the authority on time. So that kind of famous debate between Bergson and Einstein, where Bergson was a celebrity and Einstein was this up-and-comer. And the sense that today we live in a world where the scientist is the authority on notions of time and concepts of time. I think that's also really interesting and shows the certain gaps in our capacity to think future time and deep time. There are other forms of expertise that could be included. So yeah, really interesting that people have commented on that as well.
Great, Matthias. I think we'll go back to the first question, and I think that we'll try to. So there are 3 more questions right now, and let's take one by one. Nina, because that was your question. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I can do that.
Please do.
Because I do think that it somehow links to what Erich said about continuation, and what the last speaker said, or speakers said about challenging the ideas about continuation of SKB, and also challenging the ideas of chrononormativity of SKB. And I do think that when you spoke, Thomas, these ideas, or the communication aspect somehow, or at least the ways in which I do think it might be framed by SKB, reminded me so very much about the whole discussion around the Voyager program, and the discussions about search for extraterrestrial intelligence, etc., etc. I mean, the whole discussion about communication, not only across time, but also across space and species, because it was also about talking to extraterrestrials, intellectually equipped extraterrestrials, etc. And in the end, I do think I followed that discussion very, very much back then. And I think it ended very much up in things that were really hoped by the utilitarianism of NASA, and what can be. And I do think, SKB is somehow embedded in, well, it's somehow what happened. We can cook down Voyager to, hey, we're here, how are you out there? And I do think perhaps we can boil down what SKB wants to. Oh, sorry, we just dumped, unfortunately, a lot of forever chemicals here. They're toxic to us, and we hope they will not be toxic to you. However, we will, take care when you dig here in the future. I'm caricaturing, but still there is this kind of utilitarianism on it. And I do understand that what you are doing, Thomas, is very different, and you want to go in a totally different direction. But how do you manage these contradictions with the overall aims of and utilitarian thought of SKB?
Yeah, I really agree with the link to members of the Earth. It's something Anna and I write about a little bit in the nuclear memory paper. Carl Sagan's, strongly influenced by this idea of the time capsule. And I think this sense of, for those who haven't, probably most people know the example, but, like a golden record player with records that, won't decay in space. Pictures of photos of people in kind of like laundry mats in, people, different faces, different cultures, supposedly, of the whole Earth. And, famously, the Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man. This is meant to be an archive for aliens, for any subject whatsoever, which is exactly brilliant analogy to what the key information files are almost trying to do. And I think there is this really important problem, it's what we write about in the nuclear memory paper, which is, why is it that these ideas, the idea of time capsules, so dominant in 20th century thinking and continues to a certain extent today? Why is it we think archives can represent the universal human, or even timelessness itself? The idea that an archive isn't just a situated thing, but something that can speak to any subject whatsoever, and post-human subjects. These are really, I think, real problems, conceptual problems for something like a KIF. And one other point being that I guess we write a little bit about the, engaging with these problems can be kind of read as a kind of tacit agreement with the plans. And I should be clear that, there's burying waste in the ground for eternity. There's a real failure of thinking there that needs to be understood. And how have we got to that point? And what does it mean in terms of how we deal with environmental problems and evaluate them? And I guess the sense of urgency about dealing with things. And one of the things that colours SKB's thinking is that this is the responsible thing to do. We're not leaving it to burden future generations. And of course, you could interrogate that logic like you did, Nina. So thanks for the comment.
Okay, my dears, thank you so much. Then there is a question from Daisy and question from Ellie, and I'm thinking that maybe I can, because Daisy had to leave, so I'm just going to read this. And I don't know, maybe Ellie, I know that we are kind of, but we can steal 5 minutes. So if Ellie wants to ask the second question, I will ask Ellie in a second. But just to kind of read maybe this first one here. So that's from Daisy. To Thomas, I saw that you included some images from Brian McGovern Wilson's work. What are your thoughts on the folklore, intergenerational priesthood ideology approach to communicating the message across vast time? And maybe we could kind of take it together with a question from Ellie, if Ellie would like to speak, or should I read it?
Hello. Hi Thomas. Hi Erich. Hi Marietta.
Hello.
Good to meet you. So thank you for a really interesting debate. Apologies, I got the time wrong. So Erich, I missed your presentation, but of course I'm familiar with some of your work. I'm just really interested in these concepts of time being very 20th century, being very kind of located in modernity, very European, very white, very male. And what happens when we decolonize this discourse? So my question is really about what does this debate about intergenerational knowledge transfer that we're lacking? We're so severely lacking in a kind of modernist, enlightened world. How does this discourse impact on these need for political and democratic continuity? What might we need to do now to strengthen our current systems so that they are more robust and they work in the ways that we need them to work? Because at the moment they're clearly failing. And Elizabeth Povinelli would describe this as an ancestral catastrophe. And it's an ancestral catastrophe of colonization, but also specifically of nuclear colonization. So I think this is something we have to kind of think about. And she has various axioms, but I was thinking about perhaps a crisis of democracy, a crisis of cultural continuity, a crisis of modernity, and then the climate crisis are all kind of embedded in this question of how do we strengthen our culture to enable RK&M to work in the future. And there are just so many massive gaps. You know, even all the cultural heritage stuff in Scotland is all based on the fact that the library will be open, but the library isn't funded by the local authority anymore, and local authorities in Britain are going bankrupt. So there is no access, you know. So there might be a KIF in a library somewhere, but no one's got a key to the library because the democratic systems are collapsing. So yeah, it sounds a bit catastrophic, but I'm wondering, like, what do we actually learn from this for the present? That's my question.
Thank you so much. And I think both of you, if you want to, you know, jump on that question.
I would like to open up the question even further, maybe. I mean, while we are at it, that we realize and recognize that this is that, as you said, it has all these basically symptoms of colonialism and not recognizing other cultures and other temporalities. We need to expand it basically to the whole, to the planet, yeah, and need to realize that there are not only different cultures with different kind of conceptions of time, but there are in fact very many different temporalities, and that these polycrises we find ourselves in, as you mentioned, the climate change, is also a result of basically not being able to maybe see. So there was maybe in the first sense, maybe even some kind of not even intentional, basically. But now as we learn more about the planet and our co-inhabitants and the systems we are part of, we need to extend this politics which we need to develop to create this this wider scope, also include the geological, the non-human, basically all these different scales which we now start to discover being part of. Like, so it's rather than a politics of time, I think it's a politics of scale, and to recognize these different scales which operate on us, but are partly just not visible to us. Yeah.
Thank you. Thomas, do you want to jump in?
Just to concur, I mean, in the sense that I think admitting different possibilities of metaphysics of time, and I think it's really a really difficult task, but a necessary one. I also think there's an element of this, thinking about Povinelli's writing, she talks about like non-life in geontologies and this kind of expanse of time that's completely inhuman. And I think there's an element of that too, that there's something of eternity that just is, it does not join up to, I mean, I think about the le and la politique distinction. There's no possibility of admitting eternity into la politique. There's a kind of, it does not, it's, there's a kind of impossibility that it can be managed. It's completely unmanageable from kind of institutions today. But there is a different politics still at play. The le politique still kind of remains, and something there. But I don't think that institutions have this handle on, I mean, yeah, we don't see the consequences. The brilliant book, The Footprints, the Search of Future Fossils book, and the really lovely introduction, just trying to get the scale of, even the carbon in the atmosphere. We won't register the effects of that for so long, and it's the hyper objects of these things are difficult to grasp. And so I think there's political potential there, but not in a kind of institutional sense. I think it's really antithetical. But it'd be interesting to continue the debate there, because I think I'm kind of interested to see what kind of remaking of political institutions you might have in mind, because it's really interesting.
But my dears, I think that, at this point we've reached the kind of closing time. We actually exceeded the closing time of this webinar, and I believe that this discussion could go on and on, because I think that there's been many things sort of popping up here, and hopefully also you take it with you, and I mean also in a sense that please feel free to reach out to our speakers. So if you feel that your question was unanswered fully, or you think about something else, I mean, I'm pretty sure that both Erich and Thomas are pretty open to actually continuing that conversation. And of course, I do hope that we see you also next month on the 15th of February, when we have another session on the kind of very geological and very earthly matters with Mirko Nikolic. So please, stay up to date, check our website from time to time, and then, welcome back next month. So take good care of yourselves, and once again, all the best in the still new year somehow, 2024. So thank you so much to both Erich and Thomas, and to everyone one more time. Thank you, my dears, and take good care.
Thank you.